Today is Thursday, October 30th, 2003. This is the beginning of an interview with Mr. Jerry Mandel. Mr. Mandel is a veteran of World War II. He was in the U.S. Army Air Corps. Mr. Mandel, this is your story, and we would like for you to tell it in your own words. This interview is being conducted at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia. My name is Frederick Wallace, and I am the interviewer. So, Mr. Mandel, will you begin by telling us when, where, and why you enlisted in the service, and just take us step by step through your military experience?
Well, I was born and raised in Newark, New Jersey, and I remember when Pearl Harbor came, I was just a young fellow, just 20 years old, and of course I was registered for the draft. My brother was registered for the draft, and that was in December of 41, and in February of 42 I enlisted we had a family business, and I hoped my enlistment would keep my brother out for a few years anyhow, and that did happen, and he went into service later on. And I went into service from Newark, New Jersey, and you know, I just knew, first I had to say, I wasn't a hero. I just did what I had to do, and what everybody else had to do, and I went go through it for $1 million, and I won't take $1 million for the experience. That's what everybody says. But anyhow, I went to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and it was cold. I remember it was so cold there, and it was part of there was no Air Force then. It was part of the Army. It was called the Army Air Corps. But I asked to be in the medics, and I don't know why, but they picked me out to be in the Air Corps. And they sent us to Keesler Field, which was Biloxi, Mississippi. And we were about the first ones. They had an aircraft mechanics training school there, and we went to school. I think the course was ordinarily a few years, but they compressed it to about 4 months. We went to school, I think, from 6 at night till 6 in the morning, 12 hours, 7 days a week. It was really a compressed course, and they gave us all this training how to be an aircraft mechanic, and I had never been in a plane in my life, but they showed us how to do it. Anyhow, from there we were sent. When we graduated, we never did have any really basic training. In fact, I never knew how to use a gun until later on. Didn't even have the leggings. They had these things you wrapped around your feet, and they had sticks that we used. Make believe we had guns. You know, it was the beginning of the war, and it was short of almost everything. But anyhow, we got through that, and we had no training whatsoever for military. They showed us how to march. That's about all. But they made mechanics out of us, supposedly. But we had no real planes. We just had mock-ups, and then they sent us to Georgia, and we were sent to Herbert Smart Airport. Herbert Smart, that was in Macon, Georgia, and they put us in an outfit called the 38th Air Depot Group. This was one of the first ones there, and then, while I was there, it was a group of men, about 300 or 400 in the group. It was some mechanics and some aircraft machinists and some sheet metal men and some hydraulic men and a little bit of everything. Anyhow, while we were waiting for the outfit to be put together, they sent me here to Atlanta, Georgia, on detached service to work at Candler Field. Candler Field was a city airport, but they had a few military planes that would come in, and we were supposed to service, and I had a crew of 6 or 7 or 8, I forgot, and we stayed here 2 or 3 months, and actually that's where I met my wife. She lived in Atlanta, and our family lived here since the 1800s, and it was a nice city to be in for a soldier, and of course didn't make any money at the time, couldn't do very many things here in Atlanta, but I remember the streetcars were free. And as long as you wore your uniform, and it was a small airport then, it wasn't nothing like, I never would have envisioned it would be like it is today. Anyhow, after that, they sent us back to a small town in Georgia called Wellston, Georgia. It's now called Warner Robins. And Warner Robins, the field was called Robbins Field, and we were probably the first ones to come there. In fact, I went there a few months ago, and they had pictures on the wall of my outfit, of one of the first ones that was put together over there. And it was a small town. Never would we envision that it would be the city that it is now. And finally, they put the outfit together, and we went to the, we waited there, and then we went to Fort Dix. Now this was right beginning of the war. It was in the summer. And from Fort Dix we waited and waited and waited, and I was real close to my home. And this was the irony of it. And the day we got there, somebody in my barracks got spinal meningitis, and they padlocked the barracks. They put a guard at each end of the barracks. They brought the meals in, and here I was, 50 miles from where I was home, and I never could go home. And we waited there until we were shipped overseas, and we didn't know where we were going. We got on it was a miserable, miserable ship. I remember it was, the food was miserable, the conditions were miserable, but you know, at the beginning of the war, they didn't have anything, and we didn't know where we were going, and we ended up, it took about 3 weeks, we ended up in the invasion of North Africa. We were the first ones in the invasion of North Africa. And we went to Casablanca first, and then they put us on one of those 40-and-8 trains. It was a miserable trip. We went over the mountains until we went to Oran. And we set up shop in Oran. We became the air depot group for the whole North Africa, for the invasion of North Africa. We supported all the Air Force and all the planes that were there, and the whole North African campaign was fought while we were there. And of course it was a bad situation. We had very little to work with. We salvaged everything we could. Every plane that cracked up, we ran out with a truck and we just stripped it down to the bare parts. And what we did, we fixed planes, we repaired planes, we stored parts. We did anything that they asked us to do. We had specialists in every field. And we stayed there during the whole North African campaign, and then we assisted in the campaign for Sicily. And then from there they shipped us, the outfit was still intact. And of course I didn't realize now, later on I realized that we lost actually about 40 or 50 from our outfit, got killed or wounded during the service over the 4 years we were there. And from there we ended up going to the invasion of Italy. And we ended up in Naples. We were the first ones in Naples, the first day that the Americans came into Naples, and they greeted us like saviors, you know. They was kissing us and doing everything they can, and we'd set up shop at a little airport up in the hills overlooking Naples. And that first few days was very bad there. We were bombed, and the Germans kept bombing the city, and it was just a bad situation. And then typhus broke out. And fortunately we were inoculated against typhus, but the civilians were dying by the hundreds every day. And we were right next to a cemetery. I remember the cemetery, and the bodies were just piled up in front of the cemetery. Nobody wanted to bury them because of the situation of they were afraid of catching typhus themselves. And then the Americans came in and they deloused the people, and they sprayed them under the arms and in the crotch, and finally they got through that. And we stayed in Naples, and we worked out of Naples most of the time. And I became a crew chief, and I became an aircraft engineer. We had a crew, and were the same ones all the time we were there. And we assisted when they had the invasion. I remember of Cassino in Italy. That was a bad situation. And then we stayed there. We kept going out and back and forth, all during the Italian campaign. And the Air Force was there, and we were the first ones, and we were the backbone of it because they needed us terribly. And we salvaged everything we could salvage. And the conditions weren't great, but we managed to go through it. You know, you didn't make any money, but you know, I could speak a little Italian, and that helped. And I could speak a little German, and that helped. And between those two things, I got along. And our conditions, after a while, you know, being in the service, you learn how to take care of yourself first. You're number one. And as soon as they started to bomb, I remember we took the armor plates from some of these planes that cracked up, and we made slit trenches, and we put the armor plates on top, and you could hear the stuff coming from the sky, you know. And when those Germans came over, they bombed the heck out of us, and you know, scared the life out of you. You know, you're a young fella, you're scared. The next day you look on the field, you see pieces of bodies just big as your fist, and then you know what war is all about. And we stayed there, and then I remember it was 1944, Mount Vesuvius blew its top. In fact, there was a story in the paper the other day. Mount Vesuvius blew its top. And Mount Vesuvius is close to Naples, about 30 or 40 miles from Naples. And we had a whole squadron of B-25 airplanes there that had fabric ailerons on the wings. the plane was made out of metal, but the movable surfaces are made out of fabric, and the ash came down from the Mount Vesuvius and it burned up all those parts, and here was about 50 planes sitting on a runway that couldn't move. Well, we had people that could help, and we moved over there, and we had a crew of about 200 of us went in, and we just worked 24 hours a day to get those planes back in the air because it was so necessary. And what we didn't have, we salvaged from other planes, and then they shipped some parts from the States, and we finally got those planes out of there. And it was a terrible thing. The Mount Vesuvius blowing its top was terrible. And then they put us to work. We assembled a whole bunch of gliders that they used for the invasion of southern France. And then some of it was shipped to southern France. And we ended up in a small town in southern France. I forgot the name of it, Nancy, I think. It was near Marseille, not far from Marseille, and that was the invasion of southern France. And you know, in the Air Force, you don't know what's going on unless you read it in the Stars and Stripes. And the radios, you couldn't get, everything was rumor. And by the time we get something from the States, a newspaper or something, it was a month later, and we used V-mail. And V-mail, you couldn't send anything. I don't know if you know what V-mail was, but you write the letter, and then they take a picture of it. Instead of having 10,000 or 100,000 letters in an airplane going to the States, they had one roll of film, and then they reproduced them back in the States again, and you had a regular V-mail, but everything was censored. You couldn't tell them anything at all. And we had a good outfit, and it was a nice bunch of fellows working there, and so many of them got wounded and injured, you know, during flights and during air raids and everything else. We were not a bombing group, or we weren't gunners or bombardiers or nothing, but we did have flying service. I was awarded my flying wings back in 1944 for the hours that I served. And we stayed there.
You were not an air crew member?
Yeah, I was aircraft engineer, but we weren't specified with one particular group.
Mm.
We went up with the planes that we repaired.
What type of airplane?
Well, it was B-17s, and B-24s, and B-25s, and B-26s. Mostly
and you worked
bombers.
on all of them?
All of those. We were trained. I went to school. They sent me to school in Maryland to work on B-26s, Glenn L. Martin planned. But I never was assigned to a B-26 outfit, but I was a specialist. I knew all about B-26s. But the B-17s, I remember the first time my crew changed an engine in Africa, and on B-17 it took us 4 days. By the time the war ended, I think we could do it in 4 hours, because you learn by experience, and everybody had their own tools, and we had special tools that we made, and we bent, and we just knew what we had to do as soon as we got into it. And then we assembled some other planes, some small, the Army had these small 2 or 3 seaters that we used for observation. Now they use helicopters, but then they used these small observation planes, and we assembled those. They were made, I remember we laughed because they were made by Bendix Washing Machine Company. On the label, on the carton, it says manufactured by Bendix Washing Machine Company. I said, how did the washing machine company make an airplane? But they did, and they used the engines, or Pratt Whitney engines, I think they were. And we had experiences that it's hard to realize what you went through at the time, because you're young and you don't think about it. But now, and none of us were really heroes to speak of. I mean, we just knew we had to do a job. And I remember my crew, when we worked on planes, there was no such thing as second best, because with a car, the engine stops, you just pull over to the side of the road. But with an airplane, when the engine stops, you go down, and there was no second best. Everything was done perfect. It had to be, because we knew someone was going to be flying the plane, and we made sure that all the work was done correctly. And it's unbelievable how much stuff we salvaged and how we put things together, because at the beginning of the war, things were short. They didn't have enough to go. I remember in North Africa, they had the bombing of the Palestine oil fields, and we had maybe 500 planes came over, and I remember only about 200 came back. The rest of them were just shot down. It was a low-level bombing. It was the first bombing of Palestine. I think it was Hungary. The oil fields they bombed. It was a very, very successful mission. But I remember there's so few planes came back because they were all shot down. And then we had armament men, we had gunners, we had navigation people, we had people that worked on radios and instruments, we had people working on hydraulics, we had sheet metal men, but I was a crew chief. We did everything. My same crew, we worked, and we had the equipment, and we knew how to work on the planes, and when we put a plane back together, we'd salvage the parts from someplace, and
As the crew chief, were you responsible for
absolutely,
that
absolutely,
airplane?
absolutely. They gave us a plane, and here it was shot up, and they had to fix it and change the engine and everything else, and we put it back and got it in flying condition again because they were so short of planes. You know, that was our job.
So you were sort of
Oh.
a supervisor or overseer
Well, I did the work too, sure.
for
but
all of the other
oh yeah, we had
technicians who
each
were
crew.
working?
We had about 8 crews in our outfit, and each one had a crew chief, and you had the other fellows, and we worked together all the time. We just like a good, well-oiled machine. We knew how to do things, and we had equipment that we sort of made ourselves. If you didn't have it, you just do the best you can. You know, sometimes you didn't have that on the field out in the wartime zone. You didn't have the kind of equipment they would have in the States, and you just did the best what you had. That's all you can do, you know. But we just did a job, and we just knew we had to do a job, and that was it. And then later on, towards the end of the war, they had a point system of going back home. Well, I was never back home once, so I got real high points. But they sort of broke up our outfit because they didn't need us anymore. So they put me in a fighter group over in Foggia, Italy, in eastern Italy. I was in Naples, that was western Italy, over the mountains. And I was there about 2 months, and then on the way back, I was on a caravan of about 6 trucks. And these guys were like a bunch of crazy fools. The roads in Italy were very small, and they had these bunkers, these concrete bunkers in the roads. They were narrow 2-lane roads, and they hit one of these things, and I ended up in a hospital with 5 or 6 other guys. And just fortunately, we'd stopped. I remember before, I was sitting right behind the driver, and the machine gun mount was on top of the truck, you know, and I was sitting right behind the driver. But when we got back on the truck, I was the last one on, so I was sitting at the end. And as luck would have it, I was injured, but the guy that was sitting in the seat that I was killed. The machine gun mount went right through his head. And I had to wait in Italy, and waited and waited and waited. There was a court-martial. And then the truck driver was acquitted, that he wasn't reckless, and there was no convoy, and he had no orders except to get us from one end of Italy to the other, and came back. I remember, to Fort Camp Kilmer, I think. That's where I got discharged, in Camp Kilmer. And it took over 4.5 years of my life, and I won't forget it. And some of my buddies are still living, and they're all in their 80s now, and they talk about the experiences, you know, and our outfit still gets together once, so it's a year, and for reminiscing, and we still have some good times together, and the stories get wilder, and they get louder, and they get more unbelievable. But we work through it together, and we you know, you get a certain bond of being through the hardships. The food was miserable, the conditions were bad, and let me tell you, in Italy, we were there most of the time. It doesn't snow very much, but it rains and cold and miserable conditions, and you go out to pick up a plane or help somewhere in the mountains of Italy. It was just miserable conditions, but you just make the best of it, and you got to take care of yourself first, because you're number one. If you don't take care of yourself, nobody else will. And we finally ended up, I remember I had an air mattress I slept on, and you make the best you can for yourself, and you do those things. And that's 4.5 years of my life. It was just time I'd like to forget, but you don't forget.
Let me take you back to the time when you arrived in North Africa. You said that you went to
Casablanca first, and then they put us on a train that went over the mountains, and they called them 40 by 8s. It was 40 men or 8 cattle. And I mean, those trains were just nothing. They were just a miserable train, and we went over the mountains, and I remember we'd stop every once in a while, and they'd give us something to eat, and the food was terrible. I mean, the food now in the Army is great, but the food we had was just, it wasn't much. It was just packaged food. There was nothing to it. But it took us about 4 days on that. Just slept on the floor, and there was no place to sleep.
Where did you go?
We went from Casablanca to Oran.
To Oran.
Oran was in North Africa also.
Okay.
And I remember, I visualized the Arabs being beautiful white robes, but it was the people were so terrible there. It was so dirty and so bad, and they didn't know what to do, because the Germans had just left, and the French were there. It was Casablanca and Oran, I think, was French originally, and the Germans had just left, and then we had some Italians, and the Italians, they didn't know which side of the fence to be on. They weren't sure. They either were on the side of the Nazis, but they were glad to see us. So my little limited Italian helped give instructions to these people and get helpers. They'd work for just a loaf of bread or anything you give them, but they'd be tickled death to help.
Where were you based in Iran? Was that
It was a little airfield outside of
a U.S. Army base, Air Force base?
It was just an airfield we took over. It was just a small town outside of Oran, about 10 or 15 miles, and it was just an air base. And it wasn't much. They put down the steel runners down and to make a base out of it, and that was it. Things were very primitive then. They didn't have the kind of bases they have now.
So what kind of quarters did you have?
What kind of what?
Living quarters did you have?
We had tents, but it rained so much the tents leaked and the mud was just like goo and it was cold. I remember at night it would get so cold you couldn't stand it. In the daytime it would get so hot you had to warm up the engine at the end of the runway, because if you warmed it up too long, we worked on P-39s, and they have an inline engine. That's the one that has the cannon through the nose. And if you warmed it up over here and brought it over there, it would be overheated by the time they took off. So you had to put it at the end of the runway and warm it up and check it out then and then take off. But it was so hot in the daytime, and then at night it got so cold. But those people were used to it, so I suppose that was the way it was. But the only thing we knew about the war then was what we could pick up from rumor and from the Stars and Stripes, the little bit that we knew then. And we used to pick up the Germans had a radio, I forgot what they called it, Access Sally or something, and that was all lies. We picked that up on the radios, and they tried to convince us to give up, but we never could give up. Everything they were saying was just lies, and we didn't believe them anyhow. But the only thing we knew about the war was what some people would tell us, and we couldn't get any real information because there was no newspapers, there was no radio, there was no television.
So what was your daily activity on Oran?
Just fixing the planes or do anything they asked us to do. Supply them, fix the planes, and supply the Air Force. We were in the Air Corps, and that's all we could do was just anything we could do to help, anything at all. If they brought a plane in to fix, we'd fix it. If they had some supplies, we had to supply them, and I wasn't in supplies, I was just in aircraft maintenance. And you learn, like I say, the school we went to in Biloxi just taught us the fundamentals, and you don't learn anything. And I remember the first day we were in Oran, and a flight of B-17s came in, and I had never even seen one, much less worked on one. But I knew, according to the books, and the instructions they gave us, and I remember that captain, he said, "Mandel, get your crew and get that B-17 to the end of the road and bring it over here." And I was scared stiff, because I got in that thing and those wingtips seemed like they were 2 miles out on each side. And the taxi, that thing, you don't drive it like you drive a car. There's no steering wheel. You bring up this engine, and then you bring up this engine, and you touch the brakes here, and pretty soon you get the feel of it. And we got the thing in, and I'll tell you, everybody in my crew was just crossing their fingers because they'd never been in the B-17, just mock-ups, and we didn't know. But then after that, you start getting confidence, you start learning how to do things. And going back now, I remember I looked at the B-17, I just wondered how I got through that bomb bay. The bomb bay was about 8 inches wide, and how I got through with a parachute, I don't even remember. But evidently I was much lighter than I wasn't quite as heavy as I am now. And we did get through the bomb bay, and you had to squeeze through some way to go from the front to the back. But it was quite an experience working on, but then you learn from experience working on planes. And so the B-17s, B-24s, big bombers, and you learn what you have to do, and you get your crew, and pretty soon you learn from past jobs, you learn how to do things, and you get the tools, and you do the job they expect you to do. But
how long were you in Oran?
The whole North African campaign, before it was about a year before we went into Italy. Yeah, we never did go to Sicily, but we did the backup supply for all the Sicily. Sicily campaign wasn't very long, and then the Air Force came from Africa. Didn't have any air bases really. I think they had 1 or 2 in Sicily, but then when we went to Naples, that's when the Germans were still in Naples when we got there, and they just left it like the day before, and it was just bad.
How did you get to Naples?
A boat from North Africa. We went on a Navy boat, and I remember it took us about 3 or 4 days to go from North Africa to Naples, and we didn't even know where we were going then. They never tell you anything,
Mm-hmm.
The conditions on the boat weren't that great, but we were glad to go somewhere else. And then we got into Naples, and we thought it was going to be just great, but it was miserable. The conditions were bad, the food was bad, the civilians were eating out of our garbage cans. There was no food left, and it was a prosperous country before the war, and they were very agriculturally, a lot of food and everything. But here, the Germans cleaned out everything before they left. There was nothing left to eat. They were just begging us. They'd eat from our garbage cans. They'd scourge, and that was a terrible thing to watch, you know.
So living conditions in Italy were worse than
terrible.
in Iran?
Oh, terrible, or worse, much worse, because it was devastated from the Germans. See, Iran wasn't bombed, but Naples was bombed by the Germans, and they left. I remember I think they hooked up the sewer lines into the reservoir, so the drinking water was no good. And the typhus was rampant then, and it was bad. And anything you can give them, we had people that were college professors just begging for food and just do any kind of work that you could give them, just give them something to do, you know, on the field. But we were very careful, you know, we had it for security purposes too.
And did you have any spare time on your hand?
A little bit. Later on, we started.
How did you entertain yourself?
We went into the city, into Naples, you know, and we made friends there, and we bring food, we bring medicines, and I could speak a little Italian, and a lot of them speak some English, you know, so which was good. But Naples was a very popular city, and it's not the kind of city that you think that Italy is. I mean, everybody in Naples is dark-haired, and the typical Italian people. When you go to Rome, it's different. And then I remember we went to Venice, and Venice, all the Italians are blonde, which was surprising. They're mixed with the Swiss people, I think. But Venice, we went to Venice, and Venice, I remember in Venice there was a whole series of hotels there. The Germans never did bomb Venice, but they used that as a recreation area. And I remember.
And were you on furlough when you went
to? That's the first pass I ever had in the Army. I never did get a furlough in the Army. Here I was in the service all those years, never did get a furlough. Just worked out like that. But I remember I got a 3-day pass. I went with a friend of mine, and we went to Venice. And you know, there you didn't get to stand out on the street and hitchhike. You got on the field and waited till a plane went to Venice and said, "You got a passenger?" We went to Venice and hoped we'd get back some way. But you know, with American cigarettes, I didn't smoke at the time. I remember cigarettes were 50 cents a carton. And that's a nickel a pack. But you could take that one pack of cigarettes, and that thing was like gold out in the streets. You get $5, $10 a pack for cigarettes. In fact, the kids used to pick up all the cigarette butts in the street, and then they'd roll them again, very close American cigarettes. But they were good trading material. You could always trade the cigarettes off. But
so the Italian people were glad to see you. They were friendly.
They were so happy to see us, because I remember we went the day after. I remember seeing Mussolini hanging in the filling station. He and his mistress were hanging, and we went into that little town, and here he was hanging by his toes, and his mistress was hanging, and they were so glad to get rid of Mussolini. He talked them into something bad. He had some good ideas, but he talked them into teaming up with Hitler, and that was a terrible, terrible thing. Because the Italians they loved the Americans. They weren't like the Germans. The Germans were arrogant, and they were just hateful, mean people. But the Italians, they loved the Americans. They were glad to see us there, and anything they could do to help us. We didn't have any security problems with the Italians at all, because never worried about that. But
and how did the people react to the body of Mussolini and his
they spit on
mistress?
Cursing him and everything else. And he did some wonderful things. He was all around Rome. Rome was never bombed because of the Vatican. Americans never bombed Rome either. So Rome was a sacred city. It wasn't touched by the Germans or the Americans. And I remember we came into Rome, and I'd been up to Casino then. We picked up some planes in Casino, and that was very bad. Casino was the invasion there, and there were so many young men my age were just sent home the day after they got there, frostbite, you know, their toes were amputated, and they just didn't have the right equipment. Now, I think now in the Army they got boots you can stand in ice water for 2 weeks and never feel it. But then the water, the ice, the cold weather, and just was very bad.
Casino was in the mountains.
No, it was
Italy?
that was on the coast, right on the coast.
On the coast.
Yeah, it was just a landing there, and it was just. And then we saw the castles that they had, and they had the mountains there. And Casino was one. There was a mountain there, and I remember They never could capture. They bombed and bombed and bombed and bombed. They never could get the Germans out. But then they got some, I remember they had some Gurkhas came from part of the British Army. They were from India or somewhere around there. And they came with their women. Women used to cook for them. And they got into those mountains some way and they got the Germans out of there. That was something to see. But we had the whole campaign in Italy, and it was quite an experience. And like I say, I'm not a hero, and I don't think anybody in my outfit was heroes. They just did the job we had to do. And
Did you ever feel your life was in danger?
oh,
at
sure,
any time?
sure. Let
During
me tell you,
bombings?
anybody that says they weren't scared is just a liar or a fool.
Mm.
Everybody's scared. You get scared. You know, young kid, you don't have any sense. I was just 20 years old, 21 years old at the time, and you're scared, you're afraid of your life, sure. You see a piece of body the next day as big as your hand, and you know what it's all about.
But it was from bombs,
From bombing,
rather
yeah.
not
No, I
somebody
didn't
shooting
ever
at
I
you.
never was in active
Okay.
bombing raids or nothing like that, no.
Mhm.
But the planes we worked on were, and we had to make sure they were correct, fixed
Mhm.
correctly, that was right. And then I got
But you
discharged.
never faced an enemy, right?
No.
Face to face or
Well,
across.
yeah, prisoners, you know.
Yeah.
But no, I never had that experience, thank heaven. But we lost quite a few in our outfit that got shot down or got wounded.
You mentioned that you met your wife in Warner Robins.
No, she lived in Atlanta.
Oh, she lived in
Yeah,
Atlanta.
and I was
Mhm.
here, I remember it was fall, and it was the Jewish holiday season, and got invited, and somebody said, "You want to have a date?" I said, "Sure." I didn't have any money, but had a date. And it was a great time to be a soldier in Atlanta because there were the only troops around here was in Fort Mac, and they were just all gone in service, so they didn't have any leave. But we stayed at the airport, and I remember we had a tent there, and we had 8 or 10 of us, and we had a cook that cooked for us, and we worked for 24 hours, and we're off 24 hours. And we just serviced any plane that came into Atlanta. And my wife lived over in Washington Street, I remember that. And we went there, it was where Ted Turner has his place now. It was called the Progressive Club. And you never could pay for anything there. Anything you wanted was always free. It was all the young girls. There was no more men left in Atlanta, but the girls who just loved it for soldiers to come there for the soldiers' dances. It was here about 2 months, 3 months, something like that. And then when I left, and I corresponded, then we got married after the war. That's right. Came back here after the war.
Mhm.
But I
So
liked
you-
Atlanta at the time.
You maintain contact with her while
Uh-huh.
overseas?
Sure.
By,
Correspondent wrote to her, and she wrote to me, and we had a good arrangement there. And then we got married right after the war. I was out in November, and I think we got married in January, so it was just a few weeks after I got out. In the meantime, my family moved from Newark. They moved to New Jersey coast, a town called Bradley Beach. They had retired. He sold his business, and I stayed there for a few weeks, and then came down here and settled here. And since the war, I got into the pawn shop business, and I've been very active in veterans affairs. In fact, I was post commander of Jewish war veterans here, and I was on the national executive board. I'm still very active in veterans affairs, and we had quite a post. We had as many as 500 or 600 at one time in our post here. That was just Jewish members that were in service. And there's still quite a few of them living, and we still meet once a month. We have dinners and we have a good time. And I've been active in veterans. I belong to Disabled American Veterans and the AMVETS and all the other organizations I belong to also. So
Mm.
it's important. And the money I made in the service was next to nothing, but it was something that kept me. I always had a place to sleep and something to eat, and always had a few dollars in my pocket, so that helped. And I remember we got overseas pay, and then I got flight pay, and that was big pay. When I first got in service, I remember the pay was $21 a month. But by the time they took out with my PX card and the insurance, I think I got $7 or $8. You had to stand in line for 2 hours. You had to salute that captain to get your $7 $1 bills, and that was all you got. And then you just lived on that all year, all month. And that was, but you never was broke. And gambling was a way of life in the service. You know, there was always a crap game, and there was always a casino game, and there was always somebody playing blackjack or something like that. And I made money doing that, enjoyed that, and had a lot of fun doing that too.
What was your most memorable experience of the war? what stands out in your mind?
Probably the most thing that we were real proud of was when they sent us to Mount Vesuvius, and we got those planes back in the air in about 2 weeks. Otherwise, there was a whole squadron, about 50 planes that were inactive. They were just, and we worked 24 hours a day, just never stopped. And we just went over there, and we stayed there, and we got those planes back in action, and we were commended for that. The whole outfit was commended. It was just a wonderful thing that we did. And then, of course, the scariest part was we started to get bombed in Naples, and those bombs coming down, and the first night you look out there and they drop those flares, and you're just like a sitting duck. They could see everything in the ground. You couldn't see them, but they were up there. And those German planes would come over, and you hear those bombs come down, and the first one hit, and then you start running like heck, and you get in a hole in the ground. And you lived out of your helmet. I ate out of my helmet. I took a bath out of my helmet, and everything out of the helmet, and the helmet stayed with me. And the first thing you know, first night we didn't wear the helmets. After that, it was helmets and everything else you could put on. You didn't want to get killed, because once you start seeing pieces of bodies, you know that.
So when you look back on your military experience, you take pride in
certainly,
being
certainly.
able to
That's
get
right.
those airplanes into
That's
the
right,
air.
because I remember when we left the service, all the airlines contacted us. They wanted us to work for the airlines, but I had enough. I went through the whole war, and I didn't get shot down, I didn't get killed, and I came home in one piece, and I was tickled to death to get home, and I said, never again. And some of my buddies went to work for Pan Am or some of these big airlines, and they had a career in that, because they had the experience from the service, and that was good. But I didn't care to do that. I was still contacted later on to go to work for airlines, but I didn't want to go to work for airlines. So I settled there in Atlanta, and I had a good life, and I raised 2 daughters here, and I have 3 grandchildren, and now we have some great grandchildren, and I made a success of myself here in Atlanta, and it's a good city, and we watched Atlanta grow from what it was in the 1940s to what it is today. At that time, it was a small town, but now it's a big, big city, and we saw it all grow. So I enjoyed that too.
Well, is there anything else you would like to share?
No, except that, like I say again, we weren't heroes. Most of the fellows, even the ones that got wounded, weren't heroes. They just did what they had to do. They just knew this. It wasn't like today. I mean, you just knew your country was being attacked, and your country was in a war, and this is what you had to do. There was no question of what. The only thing that I think bothered me, here we were using 100-octane gas to wash our coveralls in to get the grease off, and my mother and dad were sending me letters that they got 3 gallons of gas a week, and they would protect the card, and here we were wasting all that gas, but we were getting things that they could never get in the States, but that's the way the war was, and we just did the best we could under the circumstances, and we were all glad to get out of it alive, the ones that did get out of it alive, and glad to get back home. But it's a different situation today. It wasn't a lot of more draftees, and they got into service and they knew the job they had to do, and they just did it, and there was no questions asked. Everybody complained. Complaining is a way of life, and being in service. To bitch and complain, that's a way of life, but you have to live with that.
But the spirit
was always, you do the job, and that was it. And we had some crazy guys, that, we were all 20, 21, 22. The first time a lot of them been away from home, and a lot of them started to drink heavily, which was no good. And they became drunks and alcoholics, and fortunately that never happened to me. And a lot of them got in trouble for other things, but it's the first time they've been away from home, and they were drafted. And a lot of them went in, didn't want to go in, but they got in anyhow. Nowadays, the Army is all volunteers. It's a whole different situation today.
Well, we thank you very much, Mr.
Okay.
Mandel, for sharing your
I
experiences.
appreciate you interviewing me. I hope somebody will see this sometime, years from now, and know what it was all about, and know there were people fighting that war that did the job they were supposed to do.
And if you had to speak to the youth of today, what would you have to tell them?
Well, when the country calls, you go, and this is your country, with all of those warts and the blemishes and everything else. It's still our country, and if you got to fight for it, that's what you have to do. I think, in fact, I've been on also, I forgot to tell you, I've been on the draft board. I'm a member of the draft board for the last 15, 20 years. And I hope the draft board never have to be used, but if it has to be, I'll try to be fair and impartial, just like the rest of them. So I've been active in that, and I've been doing a lot of volunteer work, and this is your country. anybody that watches this thing years from now, just remember, this is your country. Good or bad, it's still your country, and you have to fight for it, you fight for it. And it isn't for somebody else to do, you have to do your job.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We certainly appreciate
All right.
this.